As a secular person, I typically don't agree with the reasoning that Christians, Orthodox Jews, or Muslims give to explain why they're deeply religious. But I recently listened to Professor Jordan Peterson discuss why he classifies himself as a Christian, something that, once I found out, surprised me. Because it's strange to me how some of the most rational, intelligent people can be religious, but Jordan Peterson has a way of explaining things that just make sense to me. Now, he hasn't by any means made me a believer in theology, but during this part of his conversation with Joe Rogan, who asks all the questions I would have, I've never heard anyone else talk about Christianity the way he does here, and this is the best attempt I've ever seen of any Christian explain why they're Christian. And what's most interesting is I am the first to admit that Jordan Peterson has thought about these things a lot more than I have. So when he talks about it, I can kind of identify, at least with the core principle behind his message. And hopefully you'll get as much out of his words here as I did.
Here's something that's really interesting about that. So I spent a lot of time, I'm a scientist, but I'm also, I would say I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply religious person. And
how do you reconcile those?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's that, and I've spent 40 years thinking about that. And for 20 of those years, I did almost nothing but think about that all the time. And I realized something, partly from reading Carl Jung. And what I realized was that even the fundamentalists have the wrong idea about religious truth. Religious truth is not scientific truth, like the stories in Genesis, which are very old stories, maybe tens of thousands of years old. They're obviously not scientific theories because the people who wrote them weren't scientists. We didn't have science until about 500 years ago. So the idea that the stories in Genesis are scientific theories is it's just false on every possible front. And so then you might say, well, there's no other truth but scientific truth. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not true. Because what scientific truth tells you is what things are. But genuine religious truth tells you how you should act. And those things are not the same. And so a great story, like a great novel, which is a quasi-religious construction, because it's like a distillation of ordinary life into its most important elements, that's a map about how you should comport yourself in the world. And you might say, well, what do you mean by should? And because that's the question the moral relativists ask. And there's an answer to that, too, as far as I can tell. And I got this partly from reading Jean Piaget. So imagine that here's how you should act. You should act so that things are good for you like they would be for someone you're taking care of. But they have to be good for you in a way that's also good for your family. And they have to be good for you and your family in a way that's also good for society. And maybe even also good for the broader environment, if you can manage that. So it's balanced at all those levels. And then that has to be good for you and your family and society and the world right now and next week and next month and a year from now and 10 years from now. And so it's this harmonious balancing of multiple layers of being simultaneously. And that's a Darwinian reality, I would say. Your brain is actually attuned to tell you when you're doing that. And the way it tells you is that it reveals that what you're doing is meaningful. That's the sign that and your nervous system is adapted to do this. It's adapted to exist, I would say, on the edge between order and chaos. And chaos is where things are so complex you can't handle it, and order is where things are so rigid that it's too restrictive. In between that, there's a place that's meaningful, where you're partly stabilized and partly curious, and you're operating in a manner that increases your scope of knowledge. So you're inquiring and growing, and at the same time you're stabilizing and renewing you, your family, society, nature, now, next week, next month, and next year. And when you have an intimation of meaning, then you know you're there. And I can give you an existential demonstration of that. So imagine that each of these levels of existence, the way I just laid them out, are like patterns. They're patterns within patterns within patterns within patterns. And there's a way of making all that harmonious. That's what music models. That's why music is so meaningful. You know, you take a beautiful orchestral composition, and all the instruments are doing different things at different levels, but they all flow together harmoniously, and you're right in the middle of that as a listener, and it fills you with a sense of, it's almost like a sense of religious awe, even if you're a punk rock nihilist, you know. And the reason for that is because the music is modeling the manner of being that's harmonious. It's the proper way to exist. And religious writings, in the deepest sense, so those are archetypal writings, are guidelines to that mode of being. So they're not true like scientific truth is true. I think of them as they're hyper true or meta true. It's like we take the most true things about your life, and then we take the most true things about 10 other people's lives, and we amalgamate them into a single figure, and that would be like a literary hero. And then we take 1,000 literary heroes, and we extract out from each of them what makes the most heroic person. That's a religious deity. That's what Christ is. He's a meta-hero. And that sits at the bottom of Western civilization. And his archetypal mode of being is true speech. Like, look at this discussion that we're having to the degree that it's working. We're both trying to articulate our notions of reality. And I do that, and you listen, and maybe you have some comments, and then you do that, and I listen, and maybe you have some comments. But together we're building something that's different from what we both came in here with, right? And in a sense, what we're doing is we're participating in the process of articulating each other's spirits. And I mean that most technically. Like, part of your spirit is an amalgam of the information that you've encountered. A lot of that's articulated wisdom. And so it's soul construction. If you're having a good conversation, and that's also a conversation that is meaningful, and you can tell that when you're having it, it's that you're decomposing parts of yourself, your false presuppositions, you're letting them die, and you're letting something new be born as an alternative, and you're participating in this process of death and rebirth constantly when you're having a meaningful conversation. It's like, oh, that was wrong, I'm going to let that die. Ooh, that's a little painful, I was kind of attached to that concept, but I'll let it go, I'll let it burn off, and a new part of you will emerge, and then another part dies, and a new part emerges, and that's this process of eternal death and rebirth that's part of the general mythology of redemption.